Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Sustainable Commodities Podcast on the Regenerative Agriculture Summit 2025, an event which was held in Amsterdam at the start of September. For those of you who are new to the podcast, I'm Barnaby Patchett, MD of 199, a marketing and comms agency working in sustainable commodities. Conspicuous by her absence today is my usual co-host Judith Murdoch, who wasn't at the event. With that in mind, before I get started, I think it's important to say that the following ramblings and opinions expressed about the conference and some of the topics today are my own and may not reflect Judith's views. In fact, I'm sure she'd bring some very different insights to the table and challenge me on some of the things I'm about to say. To start with, I really enjoyed the event. I learned a lot. And in this episode, I'm going to give my thoughts and opinions on the conference and some of the big themes that were covered and some of the challenges and opportunities I see in regenerative agriculture in 2025. I thought the organisers did a pretty good job with the summit. They brought lots of interesting voices together. It was a really fitting venue. I apologise for butchering the pronunciation of this, but it was in the Beur van Berlage. It's a former stock exchange, so a building like on the edge of the red light district near the train station. But it's a beautiful 19th century building with some lovely decorations and artwork illustrating the history of Dutch trade, which of course includes a lot of sort of agricultural works as well. Getting to go to the conference, getting to visit Amsterdam gave me a renewed appreciation for the city too. It's such a good city. It's got a real sense of place, it's vibrant, it's interesting, it's got beautiful architecture, great public transport. It's a good place for conferences, and I'll look to go there again. I hadn't been there since my student days, when perhaps my priorities and appreciation for the city were of a little different sort. And before I start to go into the summit itself, I would like to thank the organisers for letting me come down and record. In addition to this episode and this commentary on the conference, I did also get to record several short interviews with people from across the supply chain at the conference. Farmers, service providers, policy people, technology providers. And I'm going to be releasing these, I think, as mini episodes over the coming weeks, so watch out for them. Onto the summit. An overview. For someone like me, whose background is sustainable commodities and comms, but isn't completely focused on regenerative agriculture. I thought it was really good. It was pitched at the right level for me. I thought it was really useful. I learned a lot from the program, which focused heavily on some of the challenges, especially in sort of scaling and financing regenerative agriculture. I think perhaps if I'd have been an expert working exclusively in the field, I'd have got less out of the program itself, but I've still got a huge amount out of the conference. Because, as usual, it's the conversations you have in the networking and in the communal spaces that provide so much of the best value. And speaking with all the different people from, non-profits, farmers, producers, retailers, tech companies, and multinational brands gave me, I think, a fair idea about what's happening and the different perspectives and where the regenerative agriculture space is at the moment. So I sort of left the conference, and I'm talking on the Thursday now. The conference finished yesterday. I left feeling sort of both hopeful about the clear potential for regenerative agriculture, and with a greater understanding of some of the huge challenges that I think are yet to be solved. One of the more positive takeaways from the conference, and I'll talk about some of the themes in a moment, is that people from across the supply chain do seem genuinely engaged and interested in progressing regenerative agriculture. But, there's always a but. While everyone supports it in theory, there are some huge challenges and not a lack of tangible solutions, I think, very conspicuous by their absence. I know people are working on them, but there were more challenges as I saw it than solutions, which is an issue, I think. So moving on to some of the kind of big themes, I want to start with what I felt was the biggest theme and challenge of the conference, and that's finance. How do you get the money required to invest in these projects to the farmers so that they transition to regenerative practices? How do you do it at scale? And there were multiple panels discussing the challenges of financing regenerative agriculture projects and scaling it. As I saw it, currently, the central issue is that all the risk is put onto the farmer, virtually all the risk. They're expected to invest in the processes, in the transformation, in the systems, in the data, in everything else, in the hope, and it is a hope, that they'll be rewarded, either by, whether it's a voluntary carbon market, a credit system, food companies directly, or some of the more tangible ones, improved yields or lower input costs. And in one of the interviews I did speak to a farmer who mentioned that the reduced input costs were a big benefit of the processes he'd implemented. But to do all of that, whatever they're doing, these vast majority of these farmers need access to finance. And that makes the process risky. In some cases, you're hearing about farmers literally having to bet the farm on regenerative agriculture. That's the collateral they're putting up, or some of their land for the money they're borrowing. And currently, in many cases, I don't think the maths adds up, either for the farmer or for the lender, or even for the procurement teams at the big multinationals. In fact, a big American retailer on one of the panels said as much. So what do farmers need? What do they need if it is going to make sense? Having spoken to them, they told me they needed flexibility. They needed fairer terms. They needed flexibility in terms of the length of the payback. They needed better terms in terms of the interest rates they might have to pay. But they also needed guarantors and insurance to make sure they don't lose everything if it doesn't deliver. So, and I can't remember, and I apologize, it all blurs into one to some degree. I can't remember if this was from a conversation I had or from one of the panels, but they said that the average time to transform a farm to regenerative practices could be 6 to 7 years. But often the lenders want paying back on their investment in 5. That clearly doesn't work, and something's got to change. Now, it wasn't that there weren't some suggested solutions to this, that there were. In the innovation showcase, which was, as it says, it was a showcase of some sort of startups and innovators who are bringing some new ideas and new business models to the sector. It's like a competition. There were quite a few proposed solutions for, different mechanisms and new ways of financing, whether that was involving, a platform that connected farmers with the financiers and the food companies, or involving food companies as guarantors, or getting them to co-sign finance agreements. I guess the issue was that all of these were innovators. They were startups in the early stages. I didn't see anything available at scale. Also, there was quite a lot of talk about, onto finance again, about debt. The figures I heard, and again, I can't remember whether this was, I think it was from Simon Kramer, who I had a conversation with, and there'll be an upcoming episode on. But the figures I heard were that the agricultural industry in Europe is already carrying around 450 billion euros of debt, with consumer packaged goods companies holding a similar amount. When you look at things like the levels of government debt, and this obviously has a knock-on effect on people's ability to borrow and willingness to lend. Going back to the farmers, because that's going to be a big theme throughout my kind of analysis on it today. Having spoken to the farmers there was a real cynicism about the willingness of the finance industry and the other supply chain actors to share in the responsibility of financing. They saw this as a lot of talk, and they saw it as the biggest challenge. There was also a wider recognition, I think, moving on to the procurement side, from the sustainability teams at the big corporates, about the need to bring procurement teams into this process, especially if it's going to scale. The procurement teams' budgets are orders of magnitude larger than the sustainability teams' budgets are. I guess the unfortunate thing here was that when one panelist asked the audience, how many of you are here from procurement? In a room of several hundred people, I think I saw 2 hands go up. So we're clearly not there yet either. I mentioned farmers again. One of the phrases I heard so often at the conference was either we need to focus on farmers or farmer first. The concept that because farmers are the ones who need to make the changes and have the potential to deliver these changes, we need to focus on their needs. Currently, a lot of the projects and frameworks and systems, they're top down. They feel like they can be almost imposed. It's people telling farmers what they need to do, how they need to do it, and what data they need to provide for the KPI dashboard at the finished at the other end of the supply chain. The challenge with this is that every farm is different. With so many different variables, a single process-led approach is always going to be limited. To get the best outcomes, which is, I think, what we're all looking for, the way forward needs to include the individual needs and views of the farmers rather than focusing on how can we standardize everything. And that butts up against one of the other themes that we're going to talk about in a minute. Again, in terms of solutions, I didn't hear a huge amount here from... Actually, no, you know what? I'll take that back. There was some solutions at a project level. And there are clearly some farmer-first models that work. You take Wild Farmed, who are a bit of the kind of poster children of the regenerative agriculture space. But what they've managed to achieve, both in model and in communication and in results, I think is something that people can learn from and replicate and probably should be doing. Of course, not everyone has... as Andy Cato to get involved in the promotion of that. But that's not to say they can't do it a different way. With Farmers First in mind, again, speaking to farmers, they agreed that, obviously, their views should be included. Again, there was a lot of skepticism. They felt like the chances of things changing significantly, given the current incentive structures and the current systems, was fairly slim. And that potentially they would only get the leverage to have a truly farmers first approach when things started to go very wrong in supply chains. And supply and demand, when suddenly they were able to charge more for their for their products, then we might be moving to a farmers first system. Scaling was another huge theme of the conference. How do we scale up from pilots and projects to larger system changes? Or landscape changes, or however you want to view it. How do we make things bigger? How do you scale them? The challenge is here feed into the previous two themes I've just talked about. The first is money, and the second seemed to be the fact that you can't apply the same approach to every commodity, every farm, or even every field. Where there are opportunities, as well, to make change at scale. So say the larger industrial farms or there was a lot of talk on the dairy industry potentially, and I'm not entirely sure why that was, but I assume it's to do with sort of the shared models and operating models. But this poses a bit of a risk for, smaller farmers and smallholders. As with a lot of things in the sustainable commodities space, the path of least resistance here seems to be to cut out smallholders and smaller farmers. I'd like to say that I don't think this is the intent. I don't think anyone wants that, to cut out smallholders. I think in an ideal world, all of them really do want to include smallholders. I just think it's much easier in theory than in practice. And that's the hard reality of it. If you're trying to make maximum impact and scale fast on anything, do you go after 100 small mixed farms or smallholders that all operate in different ways, and the multitude of different people you've got to work with and the multitude of different systems? Or do you go for the big producers that focus on specific commodities? Of course, you choose the latter. I think this is exacerbated by, the next theme or challenge, harmonisation. There's a broad consensus. This is something that lots of people agreed on in the room. I think that regenerative ag is so fragmented and complex, more in terms of the multitude of sort of standards, frameworks, certifications, monitoring methods, processes, outcome measures, and the data required for corporate KPI requirements. And going back to corporate KPI requirements and data, you can see what's not driving adoption. No, you can see where the priorities are of the corporates in regenerative agriculture by looking at the exhibition stands. I think it's a good way of seeing that. 80% possibly more, maybe 90% of the companies in the hall were ag tech. MRV, measurement, reporting and verification providers focused on monitoring or data provision. The words AI and satellite monitoring were everywhere you looked. And that's because ultimately the thing corporates are paying for is data for their KPI dashboards to support their commitments. They want to show graph goes up towards goal. Another problem here is they all want different data. So making all of this simpler and more aligned from, the regulatory stuff, the standards, the frameworks, the certifications, to the KPIs, I think, to the corporate KPIs, and make things so much easier and clearer for farmers in terms of, and not just farmers, in fact, for everyone in the supply chain, in terms of a way forward. The shared principles, processes, and outcomes they need to be delivering on regenerative agriculture. I feel like I've spoken more about challenges than positives, and I don't think that's fair. There were some positives, and I think one of the themes was quite positive, which is resilience. There was that recognition at the conference from, again, pretty much universal recognition of the benefits of regen ag in terms of building more resilient supply chains, both in the short term, against extreme weather events, droughts, floods, and over the long term, you're providing sustainable yields year after year. Again, in principle, of course, this makes sense, but in a world of publicly traded companies whose corporate focus may be more on the next quarter than the next decade, the incentive is always to prioritize the now, and this trips down through the supply chain. Can farmers afford to think in that sort of 10-year timescale when they're in debt? Margins are already tight, and they need to maximize yields right now just to survive. I think some of the recent weather events and challenges posed by nature in the commodity space of the past few years, whether it's the drought in olives or the impact on global cocoa, is changing that. Though I think I saw a recognition from the corporates that they need to think in longer time frames. I think this still needs to penetrate more through to the procurement side of things and those responsible for the long-term strategies. But I see that happening. And that was a positive in terms of the potential for scaling, I think. So I've talked a lot about themes, and there's one more I'd like to discuss here, and it's collaboration. So there was a lot of talk about the importance of sustainability teams working with procurement teams, and even big corporates working together on regenerative agriculture projects rather in competition. That was quite surprising to me, and it was a real definite positive. Again, it's always, in theory, of course it makes sense, but getting competitors to play nicely in the space and see it as a shared benefit or a shared necessity rather than something to compete over, especially when they are competing over the supply of these ingredients, is easier said than done. There was also a really good panel exploring a case study here from Biospheres. They're a service provider that helps organizations to develop and deploy regen ag projects. Biospheres had worked with 3 big multinationals on a successful collaborative project. I know too well from my comms experience dealing with big companies just how difficult it can be to get anything done. When you're dealing with corporate structures, in my case, sort of corporate comms teams, and in, I imagine, both of our cases, legal teams in these big companies, it's so difficult and time-consuming. The cynic in me says that these organizations, because they're so risk-averse, they employ a huge number of people whose entire job remit seems to be to find a reason to say no to things. So I can only imagine how difficult it was for Biospheres to bring, 3 of these massive companies together. And not just Biospheres, that's not fair. Also the sustainability teams driving it within the 3 big corporates to deliver on the project when they've all got different priorities. They've all got, litigious teams and they've all got different KPI requirements. It was a really good proof of concept and I hope they scale it. I think the challenges remain. This was a project and there was a clear collective willingness amongst the people in the room to scale it. But I got the sense that even the teams themselves knew there was a bit of a limit. the more it's scaled, the more potential conflicts of interest will inevitably arise in companies that are competitive when it comes to sourcing ingredients. I think there are ways around that. It's not insurmountable, though, at all. I was discussing with a few people and they suggested that there were solutions. It just required careful selection of collaborators. So companies aren't competing over the same ingredients. I think that's probably my my overview of all the big themes. I'm sure there were more, and there were so many conversations and so many leaders and intelligent people in the room suggesting sensible things. And I think the challenges in some way reflect the maturity of the regen ag space. Obviously, it's been around a long time, and the principles underpinning it have been around forever. But I feel like it's only really gathered steam as a collective sort of movement, especially in the corporate sphere, within the last 5 years or so. So, of course, there are going to be huge challenges. Before I kind of close up on a couple of bits, I meant to mention this earlier. One of the interesting aspects of the summit was that there was a small, very peaceful protest outside against it. Another interesting aspect of the summit, I meant to mention this earlier, was that there was a small, peaceful protest outside against it, led by, I think they're called ASEED. So that's Action for Solidarity, Equality, Environment and Diversity. A small grassroots organisation fighting the structural causes of social and environmental injustice in food systems. They were perfectly friendly and pleasant, and I spoke to a few of them briefly at the start of the first day about why they were there and what their issues were, and they handed out some leaflets on that. I did invite them to email me so I could ask some questions, but they haven't as yet. And as I'm recording straight after the conference, that's not a slight on them at all. But I would have liked to have included more of their information. So why were they there? They saw the conference in very negative terms, obviously, or they wouldn't have been protesting. But they saw it as a platform for corporate greenwashing. Their central argument was that corporates have basically unfairly co-opted the phrase and the movement of regenerative agriculture for their own means. And they saw the focus on, corporate objectives, such as the KPI dashboards, I guess, as preventing genuine progress on regenerative agriculture. They said that with corporates, the big corporates leading it, you never see what they wanted to see, which was equitable land distribution, access to food as an inalienable right, fair prices, collective self-determination, and, agroecology prioritised as part of the movement. And I think they have some fair arguments there. The conference was not dominated, but it was certainly led by the voices of big multinationals, and the incentives do seem to be focused on KPI dashboards. But I guess I question their methods. I'd have really liked to see them inside the conference, putting these points across and discussing it and engaging with people rather than standing outside. I really question the kind of those methods. You see boycotts like this in a lot of different spaces. So and I think they have their place. But I think in this case, they're often counterproductive, let's say. And I think you can see that in the political protest environment of the last 5 years. I'm not convinced they're achieving what they want to through boycotting this conference. They'd be better getting inside, having their voices heard and suggesting solutions, of which they had in some of their pamphlets, but they could have voiced those. It's no secret that that multinationals have a checkered past when it comes to all aspects of ESG sustainability. But, there's always a but, these are also the organisations with the biggest capacity to change. And I think inside these organisations, I genuinely do believe that the people leading on regenerative agriculture and sustainability who were at that conference would have shared a lot in common with the protesters outside in terms of viewpoint, and would have welcomed their input. Some of my some of my challenge to the idea of these protests is that I think it's counterproductive when sustainability becomes religion without redemption. The idea that these multinationals have sinned and that they can't be made better and that we need to burn it all down. I just don't think it's it's realistic. I don't think it's right. I think organisations are making progress, even at that big corporate end. And it's never going to be as fast or as far as you'd want it to be. They won't ever be pure enough. There's more they could and should be doing. But I believe that things can, have and will change, and that the best progress can be found by engaging with them, these big organisations, to make it happen as fast as possible. There's a carrot and there's a stick approach to this. They're ultimately the people who have the ability to make the biggest change, and you can encourage them to do it, and you can show them the benefits of doing it. And I think that conferences like this are a good opportunity to do that. And you can encourage them, you can use more stick than carrot, and you can kind of use your protest and your voice to encourage governments to legislate it. And that also has a place. But yeah, ultimately, I believe that things can change, and we need to engage with the organisations. If anyone because I'm talking about them without them being here, and that's unfair, if anyone from AC does want to come on, challenge me on what I've said here, or just communicate their points in more nuance and detail, they're very welcome guests on the Sustainable Commodities Podcast. I'm not hard to find, and we've got a firm commitment to all guests. We won't stitch you up. So yeah, please get in touch. So before I kind of close things up, I want to end on an assessment of where I see the space, the opportunities in regenerative agriculture, and the viewpoints amongst the different people. It has so much potential, it's clear. I think everyone at that conference agreed on the potential. By implementing a lot of the principles and processes, it can support so many other sustainability goals, whether that's carbon, biodiversity, soil health, resilience, fertilizer reduction. You could probably name 20 or 30. And there were loads of people in that room trying to do just that. Another good side of it, I think, from a more pragmatic point of view and a comms point of view, is that unlike lots of the sustainability movement, it hasn't yet become so politically polarized, at least not in the same way as carbon or renewable energy. Like it or not, if you say net zero, and it's become a divisive topic. It's seen by an increasingly large number of people in Europe and across the world in negative terms. Even the mention of carbon reduction or climate change alienates some people. We've really regressed on that. The same isn't true of some of the key benefits of regenerative agriculture. And I think of the communication around it and the potential for that. Across the political spectrum, if you asked the most conservative anti-net zero person out there whether they'd like the environment to have more wildlife, more bees, better soil health, they'd probably say yes. And that political inclusivity, palatability, makes it much less risky to commit to for big organisations, and less risky to talk about, and therefore more likely for people to implement. And I think from a comms perspective, again, there are huge opportunities for those willing to talk about their projects, progress, successes, and even their failures in the space. There's not enough real chat about corporates, I think, fairly unwilling to talk about their failures, which is understandable, I guess. But I think that had some real value. I know running my small business, my small consultancy, I've learned so much more from my many and various failures than I have from anything I've done well. Also, I think lots of the discussions I had with people focused on the broadness of regenerative agriculture. It's one of the benefits, or it can be a benefit and a strength. It's just how broad a church it is. There are so many things that farmers can do. Whatever they farm, however big they are, wherever they are in the world, there are solutions for everyone that can deliver, measurable outcomes. But always ends in a but. I'm sorry. I guess this broadness is a double-edged sword. It can also be a weakness. It's a bit like, with the UN SDGs. There's so many of them, and they cover so much ground. You don't really have to be doing too much to be claiming you're supporting or implementing it. If you're farming, whatever you're doing, there's probably something you're doing that you could claim counted as supporting regenerative agriculture. That's a risk, I think. That's a real risk. It opens up a significant risk of greenwashing and also relative inaction, doing the bare minimum. How do we solve this? Speaking to people there, I think their opinion was that it was about tightening up definitions a bit, having, again, standardizing, harmonizing things, having more quantifiable, agreed measurements. I think it's still going to be a big risk. I think it's inherent when you've got something that's so broad. Okay, I'll close up there. I've rambled long enough. Thank you very much for listening to my ramblings on the conference. And please look out for the individual interviews. There were some really good conversations there with actual genuine subject matter experts on that. So look out for them. And after this series, we will see the welcome return of Judith Murdoch and her wealth of knowledge and experience to the podcast as we record some more episodes in the autumn. As ever, I would love to hear your opinions on it. If you disagree with me, if you've got something to say, please get in touch. I'm always willing to speak to people and to give you a platform to air your views on all things sustainable commodities. Thanks again, and join us next time for another episode of the Sustainable Commodities Podcast.